Welcome back to H.G. Wells, and today we're going to finally talk about The Time Machine. The Time Machine, written in 1895. So I doubt very many of you have actually read the book. Probably a considerable amount of you have seen the movies. So let's make it clear. The movies and the book are completely different. The plot usually in the movies has something to do with the time traveler going into the future and arriving to a world where there are above ground dwellers and below ground dwellers. And inevitably the hero is trying to help the above ground dwellers survive from the attacks of the underground dwellers, usually troglodytes. Morlocks is the actual name. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the Time Machine to see really what the book is all about. And it's a fairly complicated book. It was Wells's first success. In 1895, when it first came out, the Daily Mirror referred to it as something completely new under the sun. Now we refer to it as science fiction. But at that time, they referred to it as what they called scientific romances. So the title of this lecture is The Time Machine, Decadents, Barbarians, and the End of Time. Because that's exactly what this book is about. Decadents, barbarians, and the end of time. And I'm going to explain exactly what that is all about. I have some nice pictures right here. This obviously represents decadence, they're having a party, having a good time. This is the barbarian that's waiting to harass and invade and rob the civilization. And the end of time, we'll get to that too. So here's the 1960 version of the H.G. Wells movie. This is the one that's very popular. George Pal was the director, and forgot the actor's name right now. It's Rod Taylor, there it is. And this kind of made him, his reputation. Handsome looking guy, going off far into the future, and he saves Weena. Weena is the character that is the woman in the novel. All right. So, and here's the original version, 1895. Of the book. And at last lecture we talked about the Sphinx. Sphinx as being a symbol of the hybrid, man and animal as one. Particularly important after Darwin's Origin of the Species, 1859. Human beings are now part of the animal kingdom. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as well. Now, this lecture is going to cover. It's a very dense lecture, so I thought I'd try to help as much as possible and tell you exactly what it is that we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about. 5 themes of this lecture. The first is the actual structure of the book and its main theme of decadence and barbarians. The second theme is the existential question of the decline and possible collapse of civilization. And the third one is the problem of the aristocratic ideal. In other words, the aristocracy. That has actually, over time, been the main component of civilization and the problem of its collapse in the 19th century. The fourth theme is the problem of what I refer to here as the beast within. In other words, in Wellsian or Wells-Darwin's model, of both what you might call the natural man and the artificial man. And I'll be talking about that. And then finally, the last chapters of the book, which have to do with what you might call the eschatological vision, which is the end of time, or the end of existence. So I want to give, this is my structure for the book, and before I do that, I just want to give thanks to David Shackleton, who wrote a very, very nice monograph called H.G. Wells' Geology and the Ruins of Time. It's a scholarly work, and he clued me in on the importance of geology in terms of H.G. Wells. I mean, it's very obvious that biology is important, but he lets the scholars and the general public that's interested know that not only was Darwin and biology very important, but geology and especially Charles Lyell was critical. So he kind of clued me in on that. Now let's talk about, I kind of, it's not a long book and it's not a dense book, but there's still some complexity to the time machine. And the first thing that we can notice in the book is that it has 3 time frames that are being explored. The first time frame is just the normal time frame, where 1895, the narrator is talking at a dinner with a bunch of friends and speculating about the nature of time. And then the second part, I call it biological time, though obviously geological time is also happening as well, but just for the time being, suspend that. So the second part is biological time, where he actually goes into the future and visits with the ELOI and the Morlock. And then finally, 30 million years later, after visiting the future society, he's off to the end of time, 30 million years later, and there's nothing there, and he describes that scene as well. So obviously geological time is happening throughout, biological time is happening throughout, but Wells has really a genius here in which he is teaching the reader about these different time frames that are going on that most people would not usually be conscious of. So we have 3 different time periods here: normal, biological, and geological. And then the second period in here, where the time traveler arrives in the year 8002 701 AD, he comes across the ELOI, that are the upper world inhabitants, and the Morlocks, who are the lower world inhabitants. And notice that here I have them labeled as ELOI as the Decadents, and the Morlocks as the Barbarians. And as I said, I'm going to explain exactly all about that in a moment. So that's the frame or the structure of the novel. And of course, it was an extremely successful novel and made his reputation almost immediately. All right. Now, here's David Shackleton. Geology and the Ruins of Time, H.G. Wells. Very good. This is the table of contents for the time machine. And as I showed you, the first 3 chapters are happening in normal time. And then from chapter 4 all the way down to chapter 14, that's where all the action is happening in terms of the Morlocks and the ELOI. And of course, that's been the usual adaptation in terms of movies and etc. Because that's a simple plot. And then finally, at the end, there is the further vision and the end of the story. So that's the way it works. And notice here, chapter 5 and chapter 6, because that's really where we're going next. In the Golden Age, and then the sunset of mankind. And this book is a series of revelations. As the time traveler arrives at a new civilization, he's trying to find out, well, what's happened? What's going on? It starts, before I continue with that, I want to mention the first part, when he's having this dinner with friends of his, and they're speculating about the concept of the fourth dimension and space-time. And the fourth dimension was actually already mentioned by several writers, but Wells uses it here as a conceit or as a method of allowing his imagination to expand. And it's very interesting that the first time that the concept of the fourth dimension was talked about was actually Edgar Allan Poe in 1848 in an essay called Eureka, an essay on the material and spiritual universe. And this is the first known instance of suggesting space and time to be one continuum, right? And I find that very interesting also because many writers put Poe as the direct antecedent, not Jules Verne, but Edgar Allan Poe as the direct antecedent of H.G. Wells. And Chris Dante in his book, Animal Fables After Darwin, sees the succeeding writer after Wells as being Kafka. So you can see that Poe, Wells, and Kafka are all in the same line of literary endeavor. All right. Now, here's chapter 4, when the time traveler arrives in the future. And again, the Sphinx is a central symbol in the book. And the Sphinx, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is a symbol of the riddle. And this is a very clever method that Wells uses, in which he transforms all of us into Oedipus. Oedipus being asked what the answer to the question. And here it is. I looked up again at the crouching white shape, and the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear when that hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? What if in this interval the race had lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem old world savage animal, only the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness, a foul creature to be incontinently slain. So this, of course, is all his Darwinian speculation in terms of the future, that he may no longer be fit in relation to the generation that existed. And very importantly, he continues describing the Sphinx, and he says at the end, it chanced that the face was towards me. The sightless eye seemed to watch me. There was the feigned shadow of a smile upon its lips. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an unpleasant suggestion of disease. So this theme of disease is a very, very important one for this period of time. First of all, on an individual level. And again, he says, upon meeting the ELOI, he struck me as being very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much. And what he's referring to here is in the 19th century, consumption or tuberculosis wasting disease was often connected or identified with the artist and the creative person. And this is a painting by Edvard Munch called The Sixth Child in 1885. So tuberculosis in human culture at the time was a mark of creativity. And here's a list, for example, of all the various artists in the 19th century who had, quote, what they call the romantic disease or wasting away disease. John Keats, Percy Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, Anton Chekhov, Kafka, Dostoevsky, Robert Louis Stevenson, Thomas Mann, Edvard Munch, Beardsley, Modigliani. And what's really interesting is that H.G. Wells himself identified with being consumptive. In his experimental autobiography in 1934, he talks about himself in approximately 1894. He had left his wife, his first marriage, and took on with a student of his. Her name was Catherine Robbins, but known as Jane. And it was at this point that he could no longer continue as teacher because he was so ill. And all he was left with was the possibility of writing in terms of supporting himself. And he writes about that. Vast arguments unfolded before us. She was consumptive. I was consumptive. We were launching on a desperate experiment. We replied magnificently that if we were going to die so soon, the more reason there was that we should spend all that was left of our brief time together. So Wells identified as being in the romantic line of artists in the 19th century at this particular time. So that takes up the personal aspect of disease. And now I want to talk about the collective aspect of disease, which is very, very fascinating. In the 1890s, there was a tremendous anxiety about the decline and the potential collapse of civilization. This anxiety actually began with Edward Gibbons, who wrote a book called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, almost a century earlier. And this book, which he had at first thought to be just one volume, turned into a 6-volume expedition. Now, this book is tremendously influential. There's a picture of Edward Gibbon. Tremendously influential, and there's the concept of the barbarian at the gates. Tremendously influential in ways that usually are forgotten. For example, Isaac Asimov wrote the Foundation series in science fiction, and he actually discusses how he took parts of Roman history and reproduced it in his Foundation series. And as I'm going to talk about, Wells did the same. It's very much about the rise and fall of civilizations. I have a nice little photo here, Barbarian at the Gates. This is the worrisome problem of when a civilization is advanced, that the barbarians will take it down the way it happened in Rome. And don't forget, England at this time was at the height of Victorian civilization, and they were very concerned about what the future is going to be. 1895 is also notable for another book that came out by a man named Max Nordau, and the book was called Degeneration. So anxious was this period of time in terms of the potential decline and collapse of civilization that Nordau wrote a book. Nordau, by the way, was a medical doctor. He wrote a book analyzing the ills of civilization along the lines of medicine. And so, first of all, he dedicated this book to Cesare Lombroso, who was a phrenologist, which was a pseudoscience. It claimed to be able to analyze your personality or character through the shape of your skull. This, of course, was a pseudoscience and was a source of a lot of racist ideas. But Lombroso's, I just want to show the introduction chapters. If you notice the titles of the chapters, first of all, the first chapter is The Dusk of Nations, meaning the decline. And then his next chapter was The Symptoms, and then the diagnosis, and then etiology, as if it was a scientific rendering or a scientific analysis of the state of British society in the 1890s, or European society in the 1890s. And he writes, "One epoch of history is unmistakably in its decline, and another is announcing its approach." And then at the end, and this is very important, he says, "The great majority of the middle and lower classes is naturally not fin de siècle." Fin de siècle was the end of the 19th century, from 1890 to 1900. And this is when this anxiety took hold in terms of potential collapse of civilization. In The Time Machine, Wells is expressing exactly that particular anxiety about the potential collapse of civilization. When the time traveler arrives in the future and meets the ELOI, he's trying to explain to himself and to the reader what exactly is going on. And as the story moves on, he attempts to give explanation after explanation of what he, as a theory, as to what is going on in that particular future. And here he writes, this is chapter 6, "It seemed to me that I had happened upon a humanity upon the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. For the first time I began to realize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we are at present engaged. And yet, come to think, it is a logical consequence enough. Strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. The work of ameliorating the conditions of life, the true civilizing process that makes life more and more secure, had gone steadily on to the climax. One triumph of a united humanity over nature had followed another. Things that are now mere dreams had become projects deliberately put in hand and carried forward, and the harvest was what I saw." In brief, what Wells is talking about is that the struggle for survival in the 19th century had been changed, and the level of security and comfort that humanity had attained had signaled the conquest of nature and the ability of man to, in a sense, chart material progress, so that no longer was it necessary to struggle in the way that it had been in the past. I'm going to talk about this some more in a minute. So this, again, he describes ELOI society thusly: "Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that this close resemblance of the sexes was, after all, what one would expect. For the strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of the family, and the differentiation of occupations are mere militant necessities of an age of physical force. Where population is balanced and abundant, much childbearing becomes an evil rather than a blessing to the state. Where violence comes but rarely and offspring are secure, there is less necessity, indeed there is no necessity, for an efficient family, and the specialization of the sexes, our reference to their children's needs disappears. We see some of this even in our own time." Naturally, he's talking about the 1890s. And now we need to talk a little bit about the 19th century. And I want to introduce two very, very important concepts. Usually we think of history as being, to some extent, repetitive. It's often said, what we don't learn from history repeats itself again. However, we also have to recognize there's the possibility and the potential for time or periods in history to depart from the past. And really, what we're seeing in the 19th century, and what we learn about the 19th century from the time of the Industrial Revolution, is that human progress is departing from the past in a way that we've never really faced before. I'm going to be doing a lecture on Robert Marx's book a little bit later on. But for now, I just want to take his principal concept, his principal theme, which he refers to as the old biological regime. We can think of the old biological regime as simply this: you cannot have population growth without additional food production. And since technology was limited, even all the way through the 19th century, population growth was very, very slow in terms of Homo sapiens. For example, in the year 1400, there was only 450 million people on the whole planet. By 1800, there was 950 million. By 1900, there was already a little bit over 1 billion. What changed suddenly from 1900 to our time now, 2020, is a combination, first of all, of the introduction of synthetic nitrates to accelerate food production, and also the advance in medicine so that our mortality rates improved enormously. So something very, very different happened in the 19th century that did not exist before. And Wells already is understanding that. The second concept that I want to discuss is the concept of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a new term for the period of time that we're living in. Essentially, it means that we've come to the point in human history where we dominate nature. This, many historians believe, started around the time of the Industrial Revolution, 1750. So this is exactly the time that Wells, in a sense, is writing, and he's writing 1890, but he already can see the outlines of the of some of the features of the Anthropocene era. And here, basically, the definition, Anthropocene is where human activity has been the dominant influence on the climate and the environment. All right, so these two ideas are very, very important, because really what Wells is talking about in this particular book, in The Time Machine, is that humanity is coming into a new period of time. And he is interpreting or translating this period through Darwinian spectacles. And his concern is that once human beings reach a higher level of comfort and security, that the vigor, what he might call the manliness of the human race, is going to be diminished. And so this was a particular concern in the late 19th century. And here he explains it some more in the chapter 6 called The Sunset of Mankind. What, unless biological science is a mass of errors, is the cause of human intelligence and vigor, hardship and freedom, conditions under which the active, strong, and subtle survive, and the weaker go to the wall? So, living in a time when a lot of the antagonistic forces to human beings is now eradicated, there's a whole new set of conditions that are coming into being. And he says, now where are all those imminent dangers? I thought of the physical slightness of the people, their lack of intelligence, and those big abundant ruins, and it strengthened my belief in a perfect conquest of nature, for after the battle comes quiet. Humanity had been strong, energetic, and intelligent, and had used all its abundant vitality to alter the conditions under which it lived. All right, let me see if there's more. Yes. For countless years, I judged, there had been no danger of war or solitary violence, no danger from wild beasts, no wasting disease to require strength of constitution, no need of toil. For such a life, what we should call the weak are as well equipped as the strong, are indeed no longer weak. No doubt the exquisite beauty of the buildings I saw was the outcome of the last surgings of the now purposeless energy of mankind before it settled down into perfect harmony with the conditions under which it lived. The flourish of that triumph which began the last great peace. This had ever been the fate of energy in security. It takes to art and to eroticism, and then comes languor and decay. And this also is referring back to the artistic movement that was called the Decadents in the 1890s. And the Decadents, in a sense, identified with the last stages of the Roman Empire. And one of the main books was this book by Jean-Ricard Huysmans called Outerboard, and it was referred to as Against Nature. The hero of the book, there's the writer, Huysmans. The hero of the book, Desessant, is described as a reclusive aesthete and anti-hero who loathes 19th century bourgeois society and tries to retreat into an ideal artistic world of his own creation. Against Nature contains many of the themes which became associated with the symbolist aesthetic. In doing so, it broke from the naturalism and became the ultimate example of decadent literature. Jean Desessant is the last member of a powerful and once proud noble family. He has lived an extremely decadent life in Paris, which has left him disgusted with human society. So the identification here, though, and it's very important to understand, the identification here is with the last of the aristocratic class. The aristocracy of Europe has been on the wane for several centuries. And in the 19th century in particular, with the rise of democracy and the Industrial Revolution, the aristocracy is a class that is just going out of time. The popular image for this literary theme is Dracula, of course. Dracula is the last of an aristocratic line and is looking for new blood to replenish what is now, a dying tree, dying family. And so this, by the way, Dracula was written by Bram Stoker. It's in the same time period, 1897. So the key idea here is that the aristocratic class is the one that Wells is the most concerned about. And here he says exactly that. The great triumph of humanity I dreamed of took a different shape in my mind. It had been no such triumph of moral education and general cooperation as I imagined. Instead, I saw a real aristocracy, armed with a perfected science and working to a logical conclusion, the industrial system of today. Its triumph had not simply been a triumph over nature, but a triumph over nature and fellow man. The too perfect security of the overworlders had led them to a slow movement of degeneration, to a general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence. And obviously here he's talking about the ELOI. So in interpreting the time machine, many people have talked about the Marxist explanation because of this one particular paragraph in which Wells talks about capitalist and labor. And at first, proceeding from the problems of our own age, it seemed clear as daylight to me that the gradual widening of present, merely temporary, and social difference between the capitalist and the laborer was the key to the whole position. So in the end, above ground, you must have the haves, pursuing pleasure and comfort and beauty, and below ground, the have-nots. So this idea of Wells as being a proto-Marxist or anything like that is extremely, extremely far from the truth. Wells, in fact, was a champion of the aristocratic class. When he looked to the past to see what had brought England to the success that it had in the 19th century, he looked to the aristocratic class as being the one who had brought the fruits of civilization. And in Experiment of Autobiography, Wells says, "Now it is one of my firmest convictions that modern civilization was begotten and nursed in the households of the prosperous, relatively independent people, the minor nobility, the gentry, and the larger bourgeois, which became visibly important in the landscape of the 16th century." He continues, "Many, no doubt, degenerated into a life of easy dignity or gentlemanly vice, but quite a sufficient number remain curious and interested to make, foster, and protect the accumulating science and literature of the 17th and 18th centuries." He, of course, is talking about the aristocracy, particularly gentlemen like the philosophers, who spent their time investigating and researching new ideas and making intellectual contribution. He continues, "Their culture, like the culture of the ancient world, rested on a toiling class. Nobody bothered very much about that, but it has been far more through the curiosity and enterprise and free deliberate thinking of these independent gentlemen than through any other influences that modern machinery and economic organization has developed, so as to abolish the last necessity for any toiling class whatever. It is the country house that has opened the way to human equality, not in the form of democracy of insurgent proletarians, but as a world of universal gentlefolk no longer in need of a service substratum, It was the experimental cellule of the coming modern state. This particular passage is very, very revealing. First, Wells is the champion of the aristocratic class. The ELOI are the aristocratic class. That is his main concern. And the future that he's looking towards will need an aristocratic class to lead it. When he talks about democracy, it is not in appreciative terms. He says, modern democracy is shown to be not an organic method of social organization, but the political expression of a phase of social liquefaction. So, as Wells notices the changes that are happening in what you might call modern society at the end of the 19th century, his gaze is looking for who might lead civilization, and specifically English society, to new heights. Which aristocracy, or what kind of aristocracy? And this was a problem. And he realized that. He said, this problem of direction in a socialist state, this search for a competent receiver, troubled my mind, and more and more throughout the 90s. I cannot now recall what first turned my attention to it. In one of his articles, he says, and yet one may dream of an informal, unselfish, unauthorized body of workers, a real and conscious apparatus of education and moral suggestion, held together by a common faith and a common sentiment, and shaping the minds, acts, and destinies of men. In many ways, Wells is an extremely conservative thinker. One can see all of human history as basically charted by elites. And Wells, even though there was democracy in the 19th century, which he probably saw more of a problem rather than a solution, he was wondering which group of people, don't forget, aristocracy means the best people, which group of people might lead the new civilization into modern times. The influence of the aristocracy on Wells started early when he was a child. This is a picture of a park where his mom worked. When Wells was ill several times, and what we thought of as consumption at the time, he spent many, many days in the library of Up Park, reading the classics. And no doubt this influenced his thinking in terms of the advantages and being in the aristocratic class and what it gave to English civilization. I have some pictures here of his own house later on down the road in Sussex, where he built a house that seemed to me to have some echo of Up Park. And here's one more of his houses. This is it's called Lou Padou. This was on the Italian Alpine coast. He was very wealthy by this time. And again, there's a sense of this aristocratic demeanor. So now let's turn to the Morlocks. The time machine can be considered an animal fable. The ELOI are the aristocracy, but don't forget, in terms of Darwinian concept, all humans are now animals. Some more civilized than others, but still all animals. After he discusses and explores the ELOI, of course, there is now the underground Morlocks. In the book, they steal his time machine, and that gives some dramatic action to the whole story. The chief component that's very interesting about the Morlocks, don't forget, is that they're cannibals. In fact, in several of Wells's books in this period of time, Island of Dr. Moreau and also War of the Worlds, cannibalism is mentioned as being an aspect of barbarism. As he goes on to the more final explanations of this world that he is visiting, he now takes up the issue of what you might call the natural man. The Morlocks represent the beast within. I grieve to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It had committed suicide, and it set itself steadfastly towards comfort and ease, a balanced society with security and permanency as its watchword. It had attained its hopes to come to this at last. Once life and property must have reached almost absolute safety. The rich had been assured of his wealth and comfort, the toiler assured of his life and work. No doubt in that perfect world there had been no unemployment problem, no social question left unsolved, and a great quiet had followed. Now, it is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfectly in harmony with its environment is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence where there is no change, no need of change. Only those animals partake of intelligence that have to meet a huge variety of needs and dangers. So as I see it, the upper world man had drifted towards his feeble prettiness, and the underworld to mere mechanical industry. But the perfect state had lacked one thing even for mechanical perfection: absolute permanency. Apparently, as time went on, the feeding of an underworld, however it was effected, had become disjointed. Mother Necessity, who had been staved off for a few thousand years, came back again, and she began below. And so what Wells is referring to now is that the Darwinian push for survival begins from our animal origins, and that can never leave us. So even though it might seem that the drives, the impulses are erased by the security and comfort that we achieve in civilization, what is lurking below is barbarism. This, by the way, sets up his next book, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which we'll be discussing as well. So one of the mistakes the critics and the reviewers of this book make is to see the ELOI as being the good guys and the Morlocks as sort of being the bad guys, which is why it's so easy to make the movie versions of the Time Machine. In fact, these two pieces, these two parts, what you might call the natural man and the artificial man, the man in nature, impulse, and the man in civilization, or the civilizing influences, are a combination that must work together in complementary fashion. And I brought here something that I think is always very interesting, the word symbolic and the word diabolic. The word symbolon comes from the ancient Greek and literally means to put together. This term is the root of symbolic. The opposite of symbolic is diabolic, to throw afar, which has to do with forces of separating, parting, and diverging. So what I'm saying is that these two parts, the ELOI and Morlocks, are not opposite, but are actually complementary pieces that need to fit together in order for a civilization to remain vigorous and to work. And Wells says as much in his article on human evolution. This view, in fact, reconciles a scientific faith in evolution with optimism. The attainment of an unstable and transitory perfection only through innumerable generations of suffering and elimination is not necessary the destiny of humanity. If what is here advanced is true, in education lies the possible salvation of mankind from misery and sin. We may hope to become out of the valley of death, become emancipated from the Calvinistic deity of natural selection before the end of the pilgrimage. We need not clamor for the systematic massacre of the unfit, nor fear that degeneration is the inevitable consequence of security. In other words, trying to avoid the two opposite extremes and find some complement of the two. And here, again, Wells expounds upon this concept of the artificial process. In civilized men, we have an inherited factor, the natural man, who is the product of natural selection, the culminating ape, and a type of animal more obstinately unchangeable than any other living creature, and an acquired factor, the artificial man, the highly plastic creature of tradition, suggestion, and reasoned thought. In the artificial man, we have all that makes the comforts and securities of civilization a possibility. In this view, what we call morality becomes the padding of suggested emotional habits necessary to keep the round Paleolithic man safe in the square hole of the civilized state. And sin is the conflict of the two factors, as I have tried to convey in my Island of Dr. Moreau. If this view is acceptable, it provides a novel definition of education, which obviously should be careful and systematic manufacture of the artificial factor in man. The artificial factor in man is made and modified by two chief influences. The greatest of these is suggestion, and particularly the suggestion of example. The second is his reasoned conclusions from addition to his individual knowledge, either through instruction or experience. The artificial factor of mankind, and that is the one reality of civilization, grows, therefore, through the agency of eccentric and innovating people, playwrights, novelists, preachers, poets, journalists, and political reasoners and speakers, the modern equivalent of the prophets who struggled against the priests, against the social order that is of the barbaric stage. So Wells is making a case that the only way out for the natural man is to stimulate the civilizing influence. Now, this concept of Wells is very, very important in the sense that we are now dovetailing history on top of biology. This was really a new way of seeing humankind history, and one which we can see is at present almost an accepted standard. But this again is almost 120 years ago. In a recent book, a very, very well-known book, popular book by Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind by Yuval Harari, he describes civilization as being almost exactly the same as Wells. In his chapter called The Arrow of History, he says, after the agricultural revolution, human societies grew ever larger and more complex, while the imagined construct sustaining the social order also became more elaborate. Myths and fictions accustomed people, nearly from the moment of birth, to think in certain ways, to behave in accordance with certain standards, to want certain things, and to observe certain rules. They thereby created artificial instincts that enabled millions of strangers to cooperate effectively. This network of artificial instincts is called culture. Same idea. When I first read this book, I said, wow, H.G. Wells come to life in the modern time. So that takes care of the second portion of the book. And the third portion of the book is very, very short, but it reminds us that the structure of Wells's thought is built on what Chris Dante calls biological existentialism. In this chapter, which he calls a further vision, which is 30 million years from the year 802701, he describes the end of time. There's no humans left. And this is simply, I called it an eschatological vision because that vision only comes about from almost a religious point of view. The darkness grew apace, a cold wind begins to blow in freshening gusts from the east, and the showering white flakes in the air increased in number. From the edge of the sea came a ripple and a whisper. Beyond these lifeless sounds, the world was silent, silent. It would be hard to convey the stillness of it. All the sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. As the darkness thickened, the eddying flakes grew more abundant, dancing before my eyes, and the cold of the air more intense. At last, one by one, swiftly, one after the other, the white peaks of the distant hills vanished into blackness. The sky was absolutely black. A horror of this great darkness came upon me, the cold that smote to my marrow, and the pain I felt in breathing overcame me. I shivered, and a deadly nausea seized me. So I've talked about Wells in terms of existentialism, and this particular last line where he says a deadly nausea seized me, to me was reminiscent of the famous book by Jean-Paul Sartre, famous existentialist work, written in 1938, which was called Nausea. So that completes this lecture on the time machine. And as I said before, the time machine is another animal fable, actually. Both Eloi and Morlock are animals. The next one is the time machine, and the next one is the island of Dr. Moreau. And this is what we're going to be taking up next. So I thank you. I know there's a lot of ideas here that were perhaps unfamiliar. Hopefully I've explained them somewhat so that you get a better sense of what the time machine is really all about. And well, will there ever be a movie made that is a literal translation of the book? I tend to doubt it. The ideas are very, very deep, philosophical, and challenging. Thank you very much for watching.